Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Neil Barlow knew what it felt like to have nothing left, but he still had a heart that wanted to help. On a cold December morning, 5 days before Christmas, he walked into a small café with just $3 in his pocket. He was recently laid off, struggling to keep his late mother's house from foreclosure. At the counter, an elderly woman named Beatrice was struggling to find enough change for a coffee and sandwich. Neil stepped forward and paid for her without hesitation. They sat and talked by the window, two strangers finding comfort in each other's company. What happened next would change his life forever. How could one simple gesture lead to something so unexpected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Neil Barlow had never imagined his 50th year would look like this. 6 months ago, he'd been a construction foreman with 23 years at Hendricks & Sons, a steady paycheck, and the respect of every man on his crew. Now, he was just another statistic, another middle-aged worker discarded when the company downsized, another resume lost in the digital void where employers wanted younger, cheaper, more disposable labor. He lived alone in his late mother's bungalow on Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom with blue shutters and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. His mother, Dorothy Barlow, had died 8 months earlier after a long battle with emphysema. Neil had cared for her in those final 2 years, watching a woman who'd once been full of fire and opinions slowly fade into someone who struggled to breathe, to speak, to simply exist. She'd left him the house, the only thing she had to give. But houses require mortgage payments, utility bills, property taxes, things Neil could manage when he had a job, things that became impossible when the severance pay ran out and the rejection emails piled up in his inbox. He had 30 days before the bank foreclosed, 30 days before he'd lose the last physical connection to the woman who'd raised him alone, who'd worked double shifts at the diner to keep him fed and clothed, who'd taught him that character mattered more than circumstances. The house still smelled like her, lavender sachets in the drawers, the faint scent of her rose hand cream lingering in the bathroom. Her reading glasses sat on the side table next to her favorite chair, as if she might return at any moment to finish the mystery novel still bookmarked on page 247. Neil hadn't moved them, couldn't bring himself to pack away the small remnants of her presence. On this particular December morning, he woke before dawn in the cold house. The heat had been turned down to the minimum, 58 degrees, to save on the gas bill. He could see his breath in the bedroom as he dressed in layers. Thermal. Underwear beneath his jeans, 2 shirts under his old Carhartt jacket. The refrigerator held the bare essentials, a half-gallon of milk, 3 eggs, the end of a loaf of bread going stale. He'd gotten good at stretching meals, at eating once or twice a day, at convincing himself that the gnawing hunger was just discomfort, not desperation. His mother's wedding ring hung on a thin gold chain around his neck, a simple band that had belonged to the father he'd never known. She'd worn it every day of her life, even after Neil's father left when he was 6 months old. When she died, the hospice nurse had removed it from her finger and pressed it into Neil's palm. "She wanted you to have this," the nurse had said. "She said it would remind you where you came from." Neil touched the ring through his shirt now, feeling its small weight against his chest. Where he came from, a woman who gave everything, who sacrificed constantly, who believed that kindness cost nothing and meant everything. She used to say, "Neil, honey, we might not have much, but we've got enough to share. There's always someone worse off than you." Even in their leanest years, and there had been many, she'd been the first to offer help. She'd given her coat to a homeless woman in winter. She'd paid for groceries for the single mother behind them in line. She'd left generous tips for waitresses who looked tired and worn down by the world. "That could be us," she'd tell him. "That could be you someday. Treat people like you'd want to be treated if the tables were turned." The tables had turned. Neil had applied to 73 jobs in 6 months. Construction companies wanted younger men. Management positions wanted degrees he didn't have. Retail and warehouse work paid so little he couldn't cover the mortgage. And at 50, with grey threading through his brown hair and the wear of hard labour showing in his calloused hands and weathered face, he'd become invisible. Nobody wanted to hire the aging foreman with the gap in his resume and the quiet desperation in his eyes. He'd sold what he could, his truck, his tools, his mother's china cabinet. He'd cancelled the internet, the cable, reduced his phone to the cheapest prepaid plan. He walked everywhere now, even in the December cold, because he couldn't afford gas. Pride had kept him from asking for help. Pride and shame. The same men he'd supervised for years didn't know he was struggling. His neighbors assumed he was fine. He'd gotten good at the smile, the wave, the doing well thanks that kept people from asking deeper questions. But this morning, counting the 3 crumpled dollar bills in his pocket, literally the last money he had until he could sell something else, Neil made a decision. He would go to the café on Main Street. He would buy 1 cup of black coffee. He would sit in the warmth for as long as they'd let him, and he would let himself have that one small comfort before returning to the cold house and the stack of final notices and the crushing weight of failure. The walk downtown took 20 minutes. The December wind cut through his jacket, and the sky hung low and grey with the promise of snow. Christmas lights glowed in shop windows, cheerful and bright, mocking his darkness. Families rushed past with shopping bags and laughter, planning holidays he could barely afford to acknowledge. The café was called Corner Grounds, a small place with steamed-up windows and the rich smell of roasted coffee beans. A bell chimed when Neil pushed through the door, and the warmth hit him like a physical embrace. He stood for a moment, letting the heat seep into his bones, feeling his fingers begin to thaw. There were a few other customers, a young couple sharing a pastry, a man in a business suit typing on a laptop, a woman reading a newspaper, and at the counter, an elderly woman in a worn wool coat, carefully counting coins from her purse. Neil got in line behind her. The barista, a cheerful woman in her 30s, waited patiently as the elderly woman counted. $1, $1.25, $1.50. Her hands trembled slightly. The coins clinked against the counter. "That's $3.45, the woman said finally, looking up with hopeful eyes. "How much is the coffee and egg sandwich?" $4.75, the barista said gently. The woman's face fell. She looked down at her meager pile of coins, then at the menu board, then back at her purse. "Oh, I must have miscounted." Neil watched her fumble through the purse again, her fingers shaking more now. Whether from cold or embarrassment, he couldn't tell. She pulled out a wadded tissue, a grocery receipt, searched desperately for more money that wasn't there. Something in Neil's chest cracked open. He thought of his mother counting pennies at the grocery store. He thought of her dignity, her determination to never let him see her worry. He thought of what she would do in this moment. "Excuse me," Neil said, stepping forward. He placed his $3 on the counter. "I've got this." The elderly woman turned to him, surprise and confusion crossing her face. "Oh no, you don't have to." "Please," Neil said. "It's no trouble." The barista smiled, understanding passing between them. "That'll cover the coffee and sandwich with the coffee for you, sir. Black, right?" Neil nodded. He hadn't planned to buy this woman's breakfast. Those $3 were supposed to be his coffee, his moment of warmth. But standing there, seeing her embarrassment transform into relief, he felt something shift inside him. This was what mattered. This was what his mother had taught him. You give what you have, even when you have nothing. "Thank you," the elderly woman whispered, her eyes glistening. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Neil said. "Would you like to sit together? It's too cold to be alone today." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much." They found a small table by the window, the one with the view of Main Street and the falling snow that had just begun to drift down in soft white flakes. The barista brought their order, 2 coffees in ceramic mugs, 1 egg sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "I'm Beatrice," the woman said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Beatrice Holbrook." "Neil Barlow," he replied. "It's nice to meet you." And in that moment, sitting in the warm café with a stranger who would become so much more, Neil had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Outside, through the frosted window, a well-dressed man in a navy coat stood watching them with intense, thoughtful eyes. Beatrice took a small bite of her sandwich and sighed with satisfaction. "This is wonderful," she said. "I hadn't realized how hungry I was." Neil sipped his coffee, black and bitter and perfect, and felt the warmth spread through his chest. "I'm glad I could help." "You didn't have to do that," Beatrice said, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "But I'm grateful you did. It's been a difficult month." "I understand difficult months," Neil said quietly. Something in his tone must have conveyed more than his words, because Beatrice set down her sandwich and looked at him more carefully. Really looked at him. The way his jacket was worn at the cuffs, the way his jeans had been mended at the knee, the way his face carried the particular exhaustion that comes not from a hard day, but from hard months. "You're struggling too," she said. It wasn't a question. Neil considered deflecting, offering the usual pleasantries that kept strangers at a comfortable distance. But there was something about this woman, her gentle directness, her lack of pity, her simple acknowledgement of reality, that made him want to be honest. "Yes," he said. "I am." Beatrice nodded. "There's no shame in it. Life has a way of humbling us all eventually." "Were you a teacher?" Neil asked. "You have that way about you. Like you understand people." She smiled. "I was. 37 years in the classroom. 4th grade mostly. I retired 5 years ago." She paused, her smile fading slightly. "My husband passed 2 years ago. Harold. He was a veteran, Korea. Good man. The best man." "I'm sorry," Neil said. "Me too." Beatrice took another sip of coffee. "We had a good life together. Raised 2 children, saw them grow into fine adults. But after he died, things got harder. The pension isn't much. Social Security barely covers rent. Some months I have to choose between medicine and food." She laughed softly, without bitterness. "Today was one of those mornings where my pride ran ahead of my common sense. I thought I had enough for breakfast. I was wrong." Neil understood that miscalculation intimately. The hope that the money would stretch just a little further, the disappointment when it didn't. "Harold used to say something," Beatrice continued, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small photograph, edges worn soft from handling, and placed it on the table between them. "He'd say, 'B, we gotta pay forward every kindness. Life's too short to keep the good stuff to ourselves.'" Neil looked at the photograph. It showed a younger Beatrice with a tall, lean man in a military uniform. They were standing in front of a modest house, their arms around each other, both smiling with the easy contentment of people who'd found their place in the world. "He looks like a good man," Neil said. "He was. He believed in helping others. Even when we didn't have much, he'd find ways to give. He'd fix neighbors' cars for free. He'd shovel driveways in winter. He'd slip $20 to the kid bagging groceries who looked like he needed it." Beatrice touched the photograph gently. "He made me better. Made me see that kindness isn't about what you have. It's about who you are." Neil felt something tighten in his throat. "My mother used to say something similar. She died 8 months ago." "Oh, honey." Beatrice reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was paper-thin and warm. "I'm so sorry." "She was everything," Neil said, surprised by the emotion rising in his voice. "She raised me alone, worked herself to the bone to give me a decent life. And she was kind, genuinely kind. Even when she had nothing, she'd find ways to help people." He paused. "I'm trying to live up to that, to be the person she raised me to be. But it's hard right now." "What happened?" Beatrice asked gently. So Neil told her about losing his job, About the mortgage, about the 30 days until foreclosure, about the 73 rejections and the slow erosion of hope. About waking up each morning in his mother's house, surrounded by her things, feeling like he'd failed her memory. Beatrice listened without interruption, without judgment, her hand still resting on his. "You haven't failed her," she said when he finished. "You're here, aren't you? You gave your last $3 to a stranger. That's not failure. That's character." "Character doesn't pay the mortgage," Neil said with a bitter laugh. "No," Beatrice agreed, "but it's worth more in the long run. Trust me on that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall more heavily now, coating Main Street in white. The café hummed with quiet conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. "My mother wore a ring," Neil said, touching the chain around his neck. "My father's wedding ring. He left when I was a baby, but she kept it, wore it every day, said it reminded her of the vows she'd made, even if he'd broken his." He pulled the chain out, showing Beatrice the simple gold band. "When she died, the nurse gave it to me, said Mom wanted me to have it, to remember where I came from." Beatrice studied the ring, then looked at Neil with profound understanding. "You come from love," she said, "from sacrifice, from the kind of goodness that doesn't quit even when it should." She squeezed his hand. "That's worth remembering, especially on the hard days." The bell above the door chimed. A man entered, bringing a swirl of cold air and snow. He was tall, perhaps in his late 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore an expensive navy wool coat and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority. He spotted Beatrice immediately, and his face transformed, worry giving way to relief. "Mom," he said, crossing to their table, "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Julian," Beatrice said, her face lighting up. "I'm fine. I just stopped for breakfast." The man, Julian, looked at Neil, then at the table with its 2 coffee cups and single sandwich wrapper. Understanding flickered in his eyes. "You paid for her breakfast," Julian said to Neil. It wasn't a question. Neil felt suddenly uncomfortable under the man's intense gaze. "It was nothing. It wasn't nothing." Julian extended his hand. "Julian Cross, Beatrice's son." Neil shook his hand. "Neil Barlow." Julian's grip was firm, his eyes searching Neil's face as if trying to read something written there. "I was outside," he said. "Across the street. I saw what you did." "You were watching," Beatrice said, sounding amused. "I worry about you wandering off," Julian said, but his attention remained on Neil. "Mr. Barlow, can I ask you something?" "Sure," Neil said, though he felt increasingly uneasy. "Why did you do it? Pay for a stranger's meal when—" Julian paused delicately. "When it clearly cost you something to do so." Neil bristled slightly. "How do you know what it cost me? The way you're dressed, the way you ordered only black coffee, the fact that you gave exactly $3. Julian's voice was gentle, not accusatory. "I've spent a lot of time around people, Mr. Barlow. I know what struggle looks like." Neil considered being offended, but there was no condescension in Julian's tone, only observation, maybe even respect. "My mother taught me to help when I could," Neil said simply. "Your mother needed help. I could provide it. That's all there was to it." Julian studied him for another long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a business card. He placed it on the table in front of Neil. The card was heavy, expensive stock with embossed lettering, Julian Cross, Executive Director, Cross Foundation. "I'd like you to come see me tomorrow," Julian said. 9 o'clock, my office." He took a pen from his pocket and wrote something on the back of the card. "This isn't charity, Mr. Barlow. It's opportunity." Neil picked up the card, reading the handwritten note on the back. 9 a.m., my office. "This isn't charity, it's opportunity." "I don't understand," Neil said. "You will." Julian helped his mother to her feet, gently draping her coat more securely around her shoulders. "Mom, let's get you home." Beatrice smiled at Neil. "It was lovely talking with you, Neil. I hope I see you again soon." "Me too," Neil said, genuinely meaning it. As they moved toward the door, Julian turned back. "Tomorrow, Mr. Barlow. Please come. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Then they were gone, disappearing into the white swirl of snow. Neil sat alone at the table, staring at the business card, his coffee going cold in front of him. Outside, the world was being buried in white, transformed into something clean and new. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 6 months, he felt something stirring in his chest that felt almost like hope. Neil walked home through the falling snow, Julian's business card tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. The wind had picked up, driving the flakes sideways, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was spinning with questions. Who was Julian Cross? What did he want? And why had he been watching from across the street? The house felt colder than usual when Neil let himself in through the front door. He stood in the small entryway, his hands numb, and listened to the silence. His mother's absence filled every room, the kitchen where she'd cooked, the living room where she'd knitted while watching her evening programs, the bedroom where she'd spent her final months struggling for each breath. He pulled out the business card and studied it again. Cross Foundation. Executive Director. Neil wasn't naive. He'd lived 50 years, worked construction for more than 2 decades, and knew that wealthy people didn't just hand out opportunities to strangers. There had to be a catch, some angle he wasn't seeing. But Beatrice's words echoed in his mind. You haven't failed her. You're here, aren't you? You gave your last $3 to a stranger. That's not failure. That's character. He needed to know what this was about. Neil didn't have internet at the house anymore, one of the many cutbacks. But his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a widow in her 70s, had mentioned she kept her Wi-Fi unlocked for emergencies. He'd never taken advantage of it before, but this felt like an emergency. He knocked on her door, feeling awkward. Mrs. Chen answered, small and spry, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Neil, come in, come in. You look frozen." "I'm okay, Mrs. Chen. Would it be all right if I borrowed your internet for a few minutes? I need to look something up." "Of course! Come sit at the kitchen table. Let me make you tea." 10 minutes later, Neil was warming his hands around a cup of chamomile tea, while Mrs. Chen's ancient laptop slowly loaded search results for Julian Cross Foundation. The results appeared, and Neil felt his stomach tighten. Julian Cross wasn't just some philanthropist. He was the Julian Cross, founder and CEO of Crosstech Solutions, a software company that had revolutionized supply chain management systems. He'd sold the company 5 years ago for an amount that made Neil's eyes widen. Since then, he'd devoted himself full-time to the Cross Foundation, which focused on workforce development and second-chance employment programs. There were articles in business magazines, profiles in philanthropy journals, even a TED Talk about investing in human potential. Photographs showed Julian at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, speaking at conferences, shaking hands with mayors and governors. And there, in several photos, stood Beatrice, identified in captions as Julian's mother, Beatrice Cross, Foundation volunteer and inspiration. Neil clicked through more articles, piecing together a story. Julian's father had died when Julian was 19, leaving the family with nothing. Beatrice had worked 3 jobs to put Julian through community college. He'd built his first software program in her basement, working nights while she slept upstairs after her shifts. When the company took off, his first act had been to pay off her mortgage and ensure she'd never work another day in her life. But she'd kept working anyway, volunteering, teaching literacy classes, serving meals at shelters. "The person I am today is because of the person she is," Julian had said in one interview. "My mother taught me that success means nothing if you don't use it to lift others up." Neil sat back, overwhelmed. This wasn't some casual do-gooder. This was a man who'd built an empire and turned it into a force for social change. A man who clearly revered his mother the way Neil had revered his. That night, Neil lay in his mother's house and stared at the ceiling. The card sat on the nightstand, its embossed letters catching the moonlight, filtering through the window. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, an office downtown." A conversation that could mean nothing or could mean everything. He thought about his mother, about the ring resting against his chest. about all the time she'd helped strangers without expecting anything in return, about how she'd believed in the fundamental goodness of people even when life gave her every reason not to. "What should I do, Mom?" he whispered into the darkness. No answer came, but in the silence he felt something, not certainty, but the faint stirring of courage. The same courage that had let him give away his last $3 to a stranger. Sleep came fitfully. Neil woke before dawn, his mind already racing. He showered in lukewarm water and dressed carefully in his only good shirt. It was wrinkled from sitting in the closet, so he heated water on the stove and used the bottom of a pot as a makeshift iron, pressing the fabric smooth against the counter. His best pants were too loose now. He'd lost weight these past months, so he cinched his belt tighter. His shoes were scuffed but clean. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw a man trying to hold on to dignity by his fingernails. It would have to be enough. The address on the card led to a glass and steel building downtown, the kind of place Neil had passed 1,000 times but never entered. The lobby was all polished marble and contemporary art, with a security desk and a young woman in a headset managing the flow of visitors. Neil felt profoundly out of place. "Can I help you?" the security guard asked, not unkindly. "I have an appointment with Julian Cross at 9. The guard checked his computer. Name, Neil Barlow. A pause. Then, yes, Mr. Cross is expecting you. 15th floor. Take the elevator on the right. The elevator was quiet and fast, the kind that made Neil's ears pop. When the doors opened on the 15th floor, he stepped into a reception area that was somehow both elegant and welcoming. Warm wood tones, comfortable seating, large windows overlooking the snow-covered city. And there, sitting in one of the chairs reading a magazine, was Beatrice. She looked up when the elevator chimed, and her face broke into a genuine smile. "Neil! I'm so glad you came." "Mrs. Cross," Neil said, relief washing through him at seeing a familiar face. "What are you doing here?" "I volunteer here 3 days a week," she said, standing to greet him. "Mostly I help with intake interviews, make coffee, remind my son to eat lunch." She took his hands in hers. "Don't look so nervous. Julian doesn't bite. He just wants to talk." "About what?" "About you." She squeezed his hands. "About what you did yesterday. About what that revealed about the kind of man you are." Her eyes were warm. "Neil, my son has spent the last 5 years looking for people, really looking at people, trying to see past the surface to what's underneath. Yesterday you showed him something rare, something worth investing in." "I don't understand." "You will," Beatrice said, echoing her son's words from the café. "Come on, he's waiting." She led him down a corridor lined with photographs, images of construction sites, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, people in hard hats and work clothes smiling at the camera. At the end of the hall was a door with a simple brass plate. Julian Cross, Executive Director. Beatrice knocked once, then opened the door. The office was spacious, but not ostentatious, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a desk organized with careful precision. Julian stood when they entered, coming around the desk to shake Neil's hand. "Mr. Barlow, thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," Neil said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Please, sit." Julian gestured to a comfortable chair. "Can I get you coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." Beatrice touched Neil's shoulder. "I'll leave you two to talk. Neil, remember what I said. Just listen with an open heart." When she left, Julian returned to his desk. But instead of sitting in his executive chair, he perched on the edge of the desk, keeping the conversation informal. "I'm going to be direct," Julian said. "Is that all right with you?" "Please," Neil said. "Yesterday morning, I watched you give your last dollars to my mother." Julian's expression was intense. "You didn't hesitate. Didn't make a show of it. Just did it quietly and with genuine kindness. Then you sat with her, talked with her, treated her with respect and attention." Neil didn't know what to say to that. Julian reached behind him and picked up a leather-bound journal from his desk. "I keep notes," he said. "Observations about people, moments that reveal character." He opened it to a recent page marked with yesterday's date. There, in neat handwriting, was an entry. Subject, Neil Barlow. Mid-50s, clearly struggling. Paid for stranger's meal without hesitation. Genuine conversation. No expectation of recognition. Follow up immediately. Neil felt exposed, studied, but also strangely validated. Why? Neil asked. Why were you watching? Because I'm looking for people, Julian said. People like you. Julian set the journal aside and walked to the window, looking out over the snow-covered city. 5 years ago, when I sold my company, I had more money than I could ever spend. More than anyone needs. He turned back to Neil. I could have retired, traveled, bought things, but none of that felt like it mattered. Neil listened, trying to understand where this was going. My father died when I was 19, Julian continued. Heart attack, sudden. He left us with nothing, debts actually. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat and put me through community college. His voice softened. She sacrificed everything for me, went without so I could have. And she never once complained, never once made me feel like a burden. She's a remarkable woman, Neil said. She is. And she taught me something fundamental, that character reveals itself in how we treat people when there's nothing to gain from it. Julian returned to his desk. The Cross Foundation isn't about charity, Mr. Barlow. It's about investment. We identify people who've been overlooked, undervalued, discarded by a system that measures worth in all the wrong ways. People with integrity, work ethic, resilience, and we give them a genuine second chance. That sounds like charity to me, Neil said carefully. No, charity is giving someone a fish. What we do is give someone the pond, the equipment, and the training. Then we let them build a fishing business. Julian leaned forward. We're renovating abandoned properties throughout the city, converting them into affordable workforce housing. But it's more than construction. We're creating employment pipelines, job training programs, financial literacy courses. We're building sustainable communities. Neil felt his pulse quicken. And you're telling me this because I want you to manage the entire project. The words hung in the air between them. Neil was certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? I need someone to oversee the construction, manage the crews, handle budgets, coordinate with contractors and city officials. Someone who understands the work, understands the people we're trying to help, and has the integrity to do it right. Julian's gaze was steady. I think that person is you. Neil's mind reeled. Mr. Cross, Julian, I appreciate this, but I'm not qualified for that kind of role. I was a foreman. I manage crews, sure, but what you're describing is leadership, Julian said. Strategic thinking, resource management, understanding people's potential even when they can't see it themselves. He paused. Tell me, when you were a foreman, did you just bark orders? Or did you teach? Did you see what each person was capable of and help them get there? Neil thought about the young men who'd come onto his crews over the years. The ones who'd been written off as lazy or stupid. The ones he'd taken the time to train properly, to encourage, to believe in. I tried to bring out the best in people, Neil said quietly. Exactly. That's what this job requires. Julian pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to Neil. This is the project overview. 4 buildings to start. 36 residential units total. We'll be hiring crews from populations that typically can't get construction work. People with records, people in recovery, people who've been unemployed long-term. Neil opened the folder. Inside were architectural drawings, budgets, timelines, photographs of the properties, all abandoned buildings in various states of decay. These men will be counting on you, Julian said. Not just for a paycheck, but for dignity. For proof that they matter, that someone believes in them. He paused. The same way I'm betting on you right now. I lost my last job, Neil said. I got laid off because the company downsized. I'm 50 years old, with no management experience beyond a construction site. I'm 30 days from losing my house to foreclosure. He looked up from the folder. Why would you trust someone like me with something this important? Julian smiled. Because yesterday you gave your last $3 to my mother. You didn't know who she was. Didn't know I was watching. Didn't know anything except that she needed help and you could provide it. He leaned back. Neil, I can teach you project management. I can teach you budgeting and scheduling. But I can't teach character. And character is what this project needs most. Neil stared at the folder, at the photographs of broken buildings waiting to be transformed. He thought about his own brokenness, his own need for transformation. "What if I fail?" he asked. "Then we'll figure it out together," Julian said simply. "This isn't about perfection. It's about effort, commitment, showing up every day and doing your best." He stood. "I'm not offering you charity, Neil. I'm offering you a job. A real job with real expectations and real accountability. The salary is $58,000 to start, with housing assistance and benefits. You'll begin next week. Training starts Monday. $58,000. Neil's construction job had paid $42,000, and housing assistance, that could mean keeping his mother's house. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Julian said. "Say you'll take a chance on yourself the way I'm taking a chance on you." Neil thought about his mother, about the ring hanging around his neck, about all the times she'd told him that kindness mattered, that treating people with dignity mattered, that doing the right thing, even when it was hard, mattered. She'd lived those principles. She'd raised him to live them too. And yesterday, for $3, he'd proven he still could. "Yes," Neil said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll do it." Julian extended his hand and they shook, a firm grip that felt like a covenant. "There's one condition," Julian said. "Complete transparency from here on out. No pride getting in the way. If you're struggling with something, personal or professional, you tell me. We work through it together. Deal?" "Deal," Neil said. Julian pulled out another folder. "This contains the employment contract, benefits information, and the training schedule. Take it home, read it carefully. If you have questions, call me." He wrote a number on the back of another business card. "That's my personal cell. Use it." Neil took the folder feeling like he was in a dream. Yesterday he'd been counting his last dollars. Today he was holding a contract that would change his life. "Julian," he said. "Why me, really? There must be hundreds of people more qualified." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I've learned in 5 years of doing this work? The people who succeed aren't the ones with the best credentials. They're the ones who understand what it means to fall and get back up. The ones who've lost everything and still found something to give." He met Neil's eyes. "You paid for a stranger's breakfast with your last $3. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are." They talked for another 30 minutes about the project timeline, the crew they'd be assembling, Neil's role and responsibilities. Finally, Julian walked Neil to the door. "Get some rest this weekend. Monday's going to be intense." "I'll be ready," Neil said. In the reception area, Beatrice was waiting. She handed Neil a cup of coffee with a knowing smile. "So?" she asked. "I took the job," Neil said, still processing. "Good." She squeezed his arm. "You're going to do wonderful things, Neil. I can feel it." Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Neil stood on the sidewalk, holding his folder and his coffee, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not just hope, not just relief, purpose. He had somewhere to be Monday morning. He had work that mattered. He had a chance to be the man his mother had raised him to be. And it had all started with $3 and a cup of coffee. Monday morning arrived with brittle cold and clear skies. Neil woke before his alarm, nerves and anticipation tangling in his stomach. He dressed in work clothes, sturdy jeans, steel-toed boots, a flannel shirt under his Carhartt jacket. His mother's ring rested against his chest, a quiet reminder of why this mattered. The first property was in the Riverside district, a neighborhood that had seen better days. Abandoned storefronts lined the streets, their windows boarded up or broken. But there were signs of life, too. A corner store still operating, a church with a freshly painted sign, people walking to bus stops with their heads down against the wind. The building itself was a 3-story brick structure from the 1920s, its facade weathered but solid. Graffiti covered the lower walls, and several windows were missing entirely, but the bones were good. Neil could see that immediately. This place could be beautiful again. A white van was already parked in front, and as Neil approached, Julian emerged from the driver's side. "Morning," Julian said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Ready to meet your crew?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Neil admitted. They walked around to the back of the building where a handful of men stood in a loose cluster, stamping their feet against the cold. There were 6 of them, ranging in age from late 30s to early 60s. They looked wary, tired, uncertain, the way men look when they've been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "Gentlemen," Julian said, "this is Neil Barlow. He's going to be your site supervisor and project manager." Julian made introductions. There was Reggie, 42, who'd served time for drug possession and hadn't been able to find work since. There was Paolo, 55, a former carpenter who'd lost everything to alcoholism and was now 18 months sober. There was Kendrick, 38, unemployed for 2 years after his factory closed. And there were 3 others, Anthony, Lyle, and Curtis, all in their late 40s, all carrying their own stories written in the lines of their faces. And then there was the 6th man, standing slightly apart. He was perhaps 58, with iron-grey hair and a face weathered by life. His arms were crossed, his expression skeptical, bordering on hostile. "And this is Floyd," Julian said. "Floyd's been in construction for 30 years. He's going to be your lead carpenter." Floyd didn't extend his hand. He simply nodded once, his eyes assessing Neil with clear doubt. Neil recognized that look. The challenge, the test, the unspoken question, what makes you think you can lead us? "Gentlemen," Neil said, addressing the group, "I know you don't know me yet. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm going to be straight with you from the start." He paused, making eye contact with each man. 6 months ago, I lost my job. Got laid off after 23 years with the same company. I spent those months applying for work, getting rejected, watching my savings disappear. I was 30 days from losing my house when Mr. Cross offered me this opportunity. He saw something shift in their faces, recognition maybe, the understanding that he wasn't so different from them. "I'm not here because I'm better than you," Neil continued. "I'm here because someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. And now we're going to do the same for others. We're going to take these buildings and turn them into homes." He looked at Floyd. "I'm going to need your experience and your skills, all of you. This isn't about me telling you what to do. It's about us figuring it out together." Floyd's expression didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed slightly. Julian handed Neil a blueprint of the building. "I'll leave you to it. Call if you need anything." When Julian's van disappeared, Neil felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him. "All right," he said, unrolling the blueprint on the hood of his truck. "Let's take a look at what we're working with." The morning was spent doing a thorough walkthrough. The interior was worse than expected. Water damage, rotted floors, outdated electrical and plumbing. But it was manageable. With the right approach, they could transform this place. Floyd followed along silently, occasionally making notes, but offering no input. The others asked questions, pointed out issues, gradually warming to the process. By noon, they'd completed the assessment. Neil gathered the crew in what would eventually be the building's lobby. "Here's how I see it," Neil said, sketching out a rough schedule. "We start with the basics, securing the structure, replacing the roof, dealing with the water damage. Then we move to systems, electrical, plumbing, HVAC. Finally, we do the finish work. If we're smart about sequencing, we can have the first 6 units ready in 3 months. "That's ambitious," Floyd said. His first words all morning. "It is," Neil agreed. "But I think we can do it if we work together." Floyd studied the schedule. "You ever supervised a project this size?" "No," Neil admitted. "I've supervised crews, but nothing at this scale. That's why I need your input. You've got experience I don't have." It was the right answer. Floyd's shoulders relaxed another fraction. "And we'll need to shore up the second-floor joists before we do anything else," Floyd said. "Otherwise, we're asking for a collapse." "Agreed," Neil said. "Can you take lead on that?" Floyd nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can do that." It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even trust yet, but it was a start. The first week was brutal. The work was hard. The building fought them at every turn, and the weather was merciless. But slowly, day by day, the crew began to gel. They learned each other's strengths, covered each other's weaknesses, developed the rhythm that comes when people work toward a common goal. Neil made it a point to work alongside them, not just supervising from a distance, but getting his hands dirty. When they hauled debris, he hauled debris. When they framed walls, he framed walls. He asked questions when he didn't know something, listened when others had suggestions, and made decisions when leadership was needed. Floyd remained distant but professional. He did excellent work, kept the others on task, and occasionally offered grudging approval when something was done right. But there was still a wall between him and Neil. On Friday afternoon, as they were cleaning up the site, Beatrice arrived with sandwiches and thermoses of hot soup. "I thought you boys might be hungry," she said, her smile warm despite the cold. The transformation was immediate. The tired, weary men became almost boyish in their gratitude. They gathered around her like she was everyone's grandmother, thanking her, asking about her week, genuinely delighted by her presence. Neil watched Floyd accept a sandwich from Beatrice, saw the way his gruff exterior softened when he talked to her, and understood something important. These men weren't hard because they wanted to be. They were hard because life had taught them to be. As the crew dispersed for the weekend, Floyd lingered. He approached Neil, hands in his pockets, his expression uncertain. "You did good this week," Floyd said. "Better than I expected." "Thank you," Neil said. "You did too. That work on the joists, that was skilled carpentry." Floyd looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Listen, I was rough on you Monday. That wasn't fair. It's all right." "No, it's not." Floyd met his eyes. "I've had a lot of bosses who didn't give a damn about anything but the bottom line. Guys who saw us as disposable. I figured you'd be the same." He paused. "But you're not. You actually care. And that matters." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Have a good weekend, Neil." "You too, Floyd." Neil stood alone in front of the building as evening fell. The first week was done. The foundation was laid, not just for the building, but for the team they were becoming. His phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "How'd it go?" Neil smiled and typed back, "We're going to be all right." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The weeks blurred together in a rhythm of early mornings, hard work and steady progress. November faded into December, and the building began to transform. The roof was replaced, the water damage repaired, new windows installed. What had been a hollow shell was slowly becoming something solid and hopeful. Neil fell into the work with a sense of purpose he'd thought he'd lost forever. Each morning, he woke in his mother's house, his house secure now thanks to the foundation's housing assistance, and felt grateful. The foreclosure notice had been dealt with. The utilities were paid. He could afford groceries without counting every dollar, but more than the financial relief, it was the work itself that sustained him. Watching the building come back to life felt like watching himself come back to life. The crew had become something more than just co-workers. They'd become a team, then something closer to family. They ate lunch together, shared stories from their lives, looked out for each other. Barlow, the former alcoholic, celebrated 2 years of sobriety with the crew bringing him a cake. Reggie received a letter from his daughter, the first communication in 3 years, and the men gathered around to read it with him, celebrating his quiet tears. Floyd had thawed considerably. He still carried himself with a certain guardedness, but he'd begun to open up. Over coffee breaks, Neil learned that Floyd had lost his wife to cancer 7 years ago. The grief had driven him to drink. The drinking had cost him his job and his reputation. And the shame had kept him isolated ever since. "I used to be somebody," Floyd said one afternoon as they worked side by side installing drywall. "Had my own carpentry business, did custom work, cabinets, furniture, finish work. People respected me." "They still should," Neil said. "The work you're doing here is exceptional." Floyd shrugged, but Neil could see the words meant something to him. "My wife used to say I had a gift," Floyd continued. "Said I could see what wood wanted to become. Sounds silly, but that's how it felt. Like the material was telling me what it needed." He paused, his hands still on the drywall. "After she died, I couldn't hear it anymore. Couldn't hear anything except this noise in my head, so I drank to quiet it. And now?" Neil asked gently. "Now I'm trying to listen again." Floyd smoothed the joint compound with practiced precision. "This project, it's helping. Having something to build that matters. Having people who depend on me." He glanced at Neil, having a boss who actually gives a damn. I do give a damn, Neil said, about all of you. A few days later, Neil found an envelope taped to his truck windshield. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined paper, the writing careful and deliberate. Neil, it read, I wanted to explain why I was hard on you at first. It wasn't about you, it was about me. I've been let down by a lot of people who promised things they didn't deliver. Bosses who said they cared but only cared about profits. Programs that said they'd help but were just checking boxes. I learned not to trust easily, but you've shown me something different. You're the real deal. You treat us like men, not charity cases. You listen when we talk. You work beside us instead of above us. I'm sorry I doubted you. I won't make that mistake again. Thanks for giving an old carpenter a reason to care about his work again. Floyd. Neil read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet. That evening, he showed it to Julian during one of their weekly check-ins at the foundation office. That's significant, Julian said, reading it. Floyd's one of the toughest cases we've worked with, brilliant craftsman, but he'd been burned so many times he'd built walls around himself. He handed the letter back. You reached him. That's not easy. I just treated him with respect, Neil said. Exactly. That's what most people don't understand. These men don't need pity. They need dignity. They need someone to see their worth. Julian leaned back in his chair. The project's ahead of schedule. The work quality is excellent, and the crew dynamic is exactly what I'd hoped for. You're exceeding expectations, Neil. They're doing the work, Neil said. I'm just coordinating. You're doing much more than that. You're building a community. That's the real project here, not just the buildings, but the people. As they talked, Neil noticed something he'd been noticing more frequently. Julian's hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee cup. There was a fatigue around his eyes that hadn't been there weeks ago, and occasionally Julian's words would come out slightly slurred, as if he had to concentrate to form them properly. Are you all right? Neil asked. You seem tired. I'm fine, Julian said quickly. Too quickly, just a lot on my plate. But Neil wasn't convinced. He'd seen enough in his 50 years to recognize when someone was carrying more than they were saying. The first building was nearing completion when December arrived in earnest. Christmas lights went up in the neighborhood around them, and despite the poverty and struggle, there was a sense of hope in the air. The crew decided they wanted to finish the first 6 units as a gift to the community, a tangible symbol that renewal was possible. They worked longer hours, voluntarily, driven by pride and purpose. Floyd took on the finish carpentry with an almost reverent care, crafting window trim and door frames that were small works of art. Barlow handled the final electrical work with meticulous attention to detail. The others painted, installed fixtures, cleaned and polished until everything gleamed. Beatrice came by every week now, always bringing food, always offering encouragement. The crew adored her. She remembered their names, asked about their families, treated each of them like they mattered, which Neil realized was exactly what Julian had done for him in that café weeks ago. The Cross family understood something fundamental. People didn't need saving. They needed to be seen. One afternoon in mid-December, as they were installing the final kitchen cabinets in Unit 6, Julian arrived with several people in business attire. Board members, he explained. They wanted to see the progress before the official opening. Neil watched nervously as they toured the completed units. These were people of influence and wealth, their clothes and demeanor speaking of a world far removed from construction sites and second chances. But as they walked through the renovated spaces, Neil saw their expressions change. Surprise gave way to genuine admiration. "This is remarkable," one woman said, running her hand along Floyd's custom trim work. "The craftsmanship is exceptional." Floyd, standing nearby in his dust-covered work clothes, straightened slightly. "The crew did all of this," Neil said. "Every man here brought skill and dedication to the work." "Then they should be commended," another board member said. "This isn't just renovation, this is restoration, real artistry." After the board members, left, the crew gathered in the empty lobby of the first building. They stood together, looking at what they'd created. 6 completed residential units, ready for families to move into. Proof that broken things could be made whole again. "We did good work here," Floyd said quietly. "Real good work." "We did," Neil agreed. "And there are 3 more buildings waiting for us." That evening, Neil received a text from Floyd. Just 2 words. "Thank you." Neil saved it, adding it to the growing collection of moments that reminded him why this mattered. These weren't just buildings they were renovating. They were lives, including his own. He touched his mother's ring through his shirt and thought about legacy, about how the kindness she'd taught him had rippled outward, creating circles that kept expanding. $3 for a cup of coffee, one conversation with a stranger, one chance taken. And now 6 men had jobs, pride, purpose. 6 families would have safe, beautiful homes to live in. And somewhere, somehow, his mother was smiling. Outside his window, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. Inside, Neil felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. The first building's grand opening was scheduled for the week before Christmas. 6 families would move in, just in time for the holidays. A perfect symbolic beginning for the Cross Foundation's expanded mission. The local news had picked up the story, and there was talk of the mayor attending the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But 2 weeks before the opening, on a cold Tuesday evening, Julian asked Neil to stay late at the office. "I need to show you something," Julian said. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, a weight Neil couldn't quite identify. They walked through the completed first building together, their footsteps echoing in the empty units. The December sun was setting, casting long shadows through the new windows. Everything was ready, perfect even. The culmination of months of hard work. "It's beautiful," Julian said, running his hand along the wall. "Better than I imagined." "The crew did exceptional work," Neil said. "They did. Because you led them well." Julian turned to face Neil. "Walk with me. There's something we need to discuss." They left the building and walked along the quiet street. The neighborhood was transforming, not just because of their building, but because hope was contagious. Neil had noticed other property owners beginning repairs, new businesses considering locations in the area. Change was spreading. "When I started the foundation 5 years ago," Julian began, "I had a clear vision. I wanted to create sustainable pathways out of poverty and unemployment. Not handouts, but genuine opportunities." He paused at a corner, looking back at the renovated building. "But I also knew I needed to build something that would outlast me." "Outlast you?" Neil said. "You're not even 50 yet. You've got decades ahead of you." Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. "Neil, I need to tell you something. Something I haven't been entirely honest about." Neil felt his stomach tighten. They found a bench, ironically in front of the very café where this had all begun. Julian sat down heavily and Neil joined him. 3 years ago," Julian said, staring at his hands, "I was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease." The words hung in the cold air between them. Neil felt the world tilt slightly. "The tremors you've probably noticed," Julian continued. "The fatigue, the occasional difficulty with speech, those are symptoms. The disease is progressive. Slowly but steadily, it's going to take away my motor functions, my independence, eventually my ability to do this work." He looked at Neil. "I have years left. Good years. Productive years. But the clock is ticking." "Julian, Neil didn't know what to say. "I'm telling you this because it's the reason the foundation exists in its current form. It's why I sold my company when I did. It's why I've been so focused on building infrastructure and systems that can function without me." Julian's voice grew stronger. "And it's why I've been looking for someone who can lead this organization when I can't anymore." Neil's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this," Julian gestured toward the building, toward everything they'd built together, "wasn't just about renovating properties or employing a crew. This was about finding someone who understands what this work really means. Someone who has the character, the empathy, the leadership to carry it forward. Julian, I'm not qualified to... You're exactly qualified. Julian pulled a folder from his coat. He'd been carrying it this whole time, Neil realized. This is the Foundation's master plan. Expansion into 12 cities over the next 5 years. Sustainable funding models. Partnership frameworks with municipalities and corporations. A governance structure designed to outlive its founder. He handed the folder to Neil. I'm not asking you to take over tomorrow. I'm asking you to train for it. To learn the systems, meet the stakeholders, understand the full scope of what we're building. I'll be here, teaching you, supporting you, working alongside you for as long as I'm able. His eyes were intense. But eventually this will be yours to lead. Neil opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were detailed plans, financial projections, organizational charts. It was comprehensive, ambitious, and absolutely terrifying. Why me? Neil asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There must be people with actual non-profit experience, people with degrees in social work or public administration. Do you know what I've learned in 5 years of running this foundation? Julian interrupted. The people who succeed in this work aren't the ones with the best credentials. They're the ones who understand what it means to fall and get back up. The ones who've lost everything and still found something to give. He leaned forward. That morning in the cafe, I wasn't there by accident. I'd been researching you for weeks. I'd talked to your former co-workers at the construction company. Every single one described you the same way. Fair, dedicated, someone who cared about his crew as people, not just labor. I spoke with your mother's neighbors. They told me how you'd cared for her for 2 years, how you'd sacrificed your own life to make sure she had dignity in her final days. Neil felt tears prickling his eyes. I chose you before we ever met, Julian said. The cafe was my way of confirming what I already believed, that you're the kind of person who gives when they have nothing left to give. That's not a skill you can teach. That's character. And character is what this foundation needs most. But I was unemployed, Neil said. I was about to lose everything. Exactly. You were at your lowest point, and you still paid for a stranger's breakfast. You still treated my mother with kindness and respect. You still believed that doing the right thing mattered, even when your own world was falling apart. Julian's voice grew thick with emotion. That's who you are, Neil. Not who you were when you had money and security. Who you are when you have nothing. Neil looked at the folder, at the scope of what Julian was offering. Executive Director of the Cross Foundation. Leadership of an organization that would touch thousands of lives. The chance to build something that mattered, something that would outlast them both.
I'm scared, Neil admitted.
Good, Julian said. Anyone who isn't scared of this kind of responsibility shouldn't be trusted with it. He put his hand on Neil's shoulder. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be you, the man who gave his last $3 to my mother. The man who saw worth in Floyd and Reggie and Barlow when everyone else had written them off. The man who understands that dignity matters more than efficiency. They sat in silence for a while, watching the cafe through the window. Inside, people were having coffee, having conversations, having moments that might change their lives without even knowing it. When do we start? Neil asked finally. Julian smiled, a genuine relieved smile. We already have. Every decision you've made on this project, every conversation with the crew, every problem you've solved, that's been your training. Now we just expand the scope, and when Neil couldn't finish the sentence. When I can't do this anymore, you'll be ready. And I'll still be here supporting you however I can. This disease will take my mobility eventually, but not my mind. Not my commitment to this work. Julian stood, extending his hand. So what do you say? Will you help me build something that outlasts us both? Neil stood and took Julian's hand. Not a handshake this time, but something more. A covenant, a promise, a commitment to something larger than themselves. Yes, Neil said. I will. As they walked back toward the foundation office, Neil felt the weight of what he'd just accepted settling onto his shoulders. It was heavy, almost overwhelming. But underneath the fear was something else, purpose, clear and undeniable. He thought about his mother, about the ring he wore against his heart. about how she'd taught him that the measure of a person wasn't what they had, but what they gave, about how kindness rippled outward in ways you could never predict. $3 had changed his life. Now he had the chance to change thousands of others. The question was, would he be worthy of that trust? Only time would tell. But for the first time in his 50 years, Neil Barlow believed he might be. Neil took 3 days to process Julian's revelation. 3 days of walking through his mother's house, sitting at her kitchen table, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd been asked to do. Executive director, the person who would carry Julian's vision forward when he no longer could. The face of an organization that would expand into 12 cities, helping thousands of people rebuild their lives. It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. But when Neil thought about refusing, about walking away, he kept coming back to one question. If not him, then who? Who else would understand what these men needed because they'd lived it themselves? Who else would lead with empathy instead of efficiency as the primary metric? On the 3rd day, he went to visit his mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, snow covering the ground in a pristine blanket. He knelt beside her headstone, his knees soaking through in the cold wetness. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know if I can do this. It's so much bigger than anything I've ever done. What if I fail? What if I let all these people down?" The wind rustled through the bare trees. No answers came, but Neil felt something. Not certainty, but the memory of her voice. "Neil, honey, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to care. The rest will follow." He touched the ring through his shirt. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll try." When Neil returned to the foundation office on Monday, Julian was waiting with Beatrice. They sat together in Julian's office, and for the next 2 weeks, Neil's real education began. Julian walked him through the foundation's financial structure, how they secured funding through corporate partnerships, individual donors, and government grants. He explained the delicate balance of nonprofit management, where every dollar had to serve the mission while also sustaining the organization. Neil met with the foundation's attorneys, learning about compliance, liability, and the legal frameworks that governed their work. He sat in on board meetings, observing how Julian navigated the politics of nonprofit governance, balancing stakeholder interests while protecting the organization's core values. The board members were a mixed group: corporate executives, retired politicians, philanthropists, and community leaders. Some were genuinely committed to the mission. Others seemed more interested in the prestige of board membership. Julian taught Neil to distinguish between the two. "These 3, Julian said privately, pointing to specific board members on the organizational chart, "will support you no matter what. They believe in this work. These 2 will challenge you constantly, but their questions make us better. And these 3, he circled the names, are looking for reasons to replace you with someone from their world. Someone with an MBA and no dirt under their fingernails." "That's comforting," Neil said dryly. "It's reality. You're going to have to prove yourself to them, not just once but constantly. They'll never fully trust someone who came from the population we serve." "That's exactly why I should be leading this," Neil said, feeling a spark of anger. "Because I understand these people in ways they never will." "I agree completely," Julian said. "But you'll need to fight for that position. Are you ready for that fight?" Neil thought about Floyd's letter, about Paolo's 2-year sobriety chip, about Reggie reconnecting with his daughter. "Yes," he said, "I am." The expansion plan was ambitious. 12 cities over 5 years, each with multiple properties and crews. The model would replicate what they'd done here, hiring second-chance workers, renovating abandoned properties, creating sustainable communities. But scaling it would require partnerships, funding, political support, and flawless execution. Julian had already laid the groundwork. Meetings were scheduled with mayors in 6 potential cities. Corporate sponsors were lined up. The first additional location, in a neighboring state, was scheduled to launch in 6 months. "That's where you'll prove yourself," Julian said. "The board is skeptical that this model can scale. They think what we did here was luck, not strategy. You need to show them it's replicable. that you can build a team in a new city and achieve the same results. The pressure was enormous, but Julian was a patient teacher, and Beatrice was a constant source of encouragement. She still volunteered at the office 3 days a week, and Neil found himself seeking her wisdom during difficult moments. "You remind me so much of him when he was starting out," she told Neil one afternoon over coffee. Julian was terrified when he launched his first company, convinced he'd fail, convinced he wasn't smart enough or experienced enough. But he had something more important than credentials. He had heart. "And so do you. How did you do it?" Neil asked. "Working 3 jobs, raising him alone, never giving up." "Because I loved him," she said simply. "And because I knew that if I gave up, I was teaching him to give up. Our children watch us, Neil. They learn what's possible by watching what we do, not what we say." She patted his hand. "Julian's watching you now. Those men on your crew are watching you. All those people in 12 cities who don't even know your name yet, they're going to be watching you. What do you want them to learn?" "That it's possible to rebuild," Neil said. "That where you've been doesn't determine where you're going." "Then show them," Beatrice said. One day at a time. The foundation gala was scheduled for the first week of January, a major fundraising event where Julian would announce the expansion plan and introduce Neil as the incoming executive director. The guest list included donors, board members, city officials, and media. It would be Neil's first major public appearance in his new role. Julian insisted that Neil co-present, that he stand on stage and explain the vision, the model, the impact. "They need to hear from you," Julian said. "They need to see the person who's going to lead this." The idea of public speaking terrified Neil. He'd led crews, managed projects, handled difficult conversations, but standing in front of hundreds of wealthy, influential people and convincing them to trust him, that was different. "I'm going to embarrass you," Neil said. "I'm going to stand up there and freeze, and everyone's going to wonder what you were thinking." "You're going to stand up there and tell the truth," Julian corrected. "You're going to tell them what it felt like to lose everything, what it meant when someone gave you a chance, why this work matters, and they're going to believe you because it's real." Beatrice helped Neil practice his speech. They sat in the conference room evening after evening, with Beatrice in the audience and Neil at the front, stumbling through his words, fighting his nerves. "Don't try to sound like them," Beatrice coached. "Don't use their language or their polish. Be yourself. Tell your story in your own words. That's what will move them." Neil wrote and rewrote his remarks, trying to find the right balance of vulnerability and strength, personal story and organizational vision. Finally, he distilled it down to a single index card with just a few words. Nobody should have to choose between dignity and survival. We all deserve a second chance. The week before the gala, Julian's conditions seemed to worsen. His tremors were more pronounced, his fatigue more evident. But he refused to slow down, refused to acknowledge the disease's progression. "I need to see this through," he told Neil. "I need to stand on that stage with you and show the board, show the donors, show everyone that I've chosen my successor and I believe in him completely." "You've already done that," Neil said. "Not publicly, not officially." Julian's voice was firm. "This gala is your coronation, Neil. After this, there's no going back. You'll be the face of this foundation. Are you ready?" Neil thought about the journey that had brought him here. From unemployed and desperate to leading an organization that would change thousands of lives. From counting his last $3 to managing a multi-million-dollar budget. From invisible to influential. "I'm ready," he said. The gala would be held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, an elegant venue downtown. The foundation had rented the largest ballroom, expecting over 300 guests. The ticket price was $500 per person, with a silent auction and live pledge drive planned for the evening. Floyd and the rest of the crew had insisted on attending. "We want to be there," Floyd had said. "Want to see you up on that stage, representing us." Julian had arranged for them to have tickets at no cost, but the crew had refused. "We'll pay our way," Floyd insisted. "This is important. We belong there." Neil had been moved to tears by their determination, their pride in being part of something larger than themselves. The weekend before the gala, Neil spent Saturday at the completed building with the crew, doing final walkthroughs before the families moved in. They worked together in comfortable silence, checking every detail, making sure everything was perfect. "You nervous about Monday?" Floyd asked, as they stood together looking at the finished lobby. "Terrified," Neil admitted. "Good. Means you care." Floyd clapped him on the shoulder. "Just remember, we're all going to be in that room. You're not alone up there." Sunday evening, Neil couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, rehearsing his speech in his mind. The index card sat on his nightstand, its simple message both comforting and daunting. At midnight, he got up and walked through his mother's house. He stopped in the living room, where her chair still sat by the window. He could almost see her there, knitting, occasionally looking up at him with those knowing eyes. "I wish you could be there tomorrow," he said to the empty chair. "I wish you could see what came from that morning in the café. How $3 turned into all of this." He touched the ring around his neck and felt something settle inside him. She would be there tomorrow, in the values she'd taught him, in the kindness she'd modeled, in the belief that every person deserved dignity and respect. Neil went back to bed and finally slept, dreamless and deep. When he woke Monday morning, the sun was shining through his window, bright and clear. It was the first day of January, a new year, a new beginning. The gala was 8 hours away. His life was about to change again, and this time Neil Barlow was truly ready. The Grand Meridian Hotel blazed with light against the January evening. Neil stood on the sidewalk outside, watching well-dressed guests stream through the entrance, and felt his stomach clench with nerves. He wore a suit Julian had insisted on buying for him, charcoal gray, well-tailored, professional. He barely recognized himself in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't the unemployed foreman who'd walked into a café 6 weeks ago with $3 in his pocket. This was someone else, someone he was still learning to be. "You look sharp," a familiar voice said behind him. Neil turned to find Floyd approaching, dressed in a dark suit that looked carefully pressed. Behind him came the rest of the crew, Paolo, Reggie, Kendrick, and the others, all dressed in their best, all looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. "You all came," Neil said, emotion tightening his throat. "Told you we would," Floyd said. "Wouldn't miss this." They walked into the hotel together, a crew of second-chance workers entering a world of wealth and influence. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, elaborate floral centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in one corner. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Neil's crew stayed close together, clearly out of their element, but holding their ground with quiet dignity. Beatrice found them almost immediately, radiant in a deep blue dress, her eyes bright with excitement. "There you are." She hugged Neil, then greeted each crew member by name, making them feel welcomed and valued. Julian appeared moments later, moving more slowly than usual, but his presence commanding attention. He shook hands with Neil, then with each crew member, thanking them for their work, for their commitment, for being there tonight. 15 minutes until we begin," Julian said to Neil. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm going to be sick," Neil admitted. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously." Julian smiled. "Remember, just tell your truth. That's all they need to hear." The ballroom filled quickly. Neil recognized some faces from board meetings, saw others he'd only seen in newspaper photographs, CEOs, philanthropists, political figures. The crew found seats at a table near the front, looking proud and nervous in equal measure. Neil sat at the head table with Julian, Beatrice, and several board members. One of them, a silver-haired man named Gregory Ashton, president of a major bank, leaned toward Neil with a tight smile. "So you're the construction foreman Julian's betting the foundation's future on," Ashton said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm the person he chose, yes," Neil replied evenly. "Interesting strategy," Ashton said. "Unorthodox. Sometimes the orthodox approaches don't work," Neil said. "Sometimes you need someone who understands the problem from the inside." Ashton studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll see." Julian rose to speak, and the room fell silent. He moved to the podium with careful steps, his tremor visible in his hands as he gripped the edges. "Good evening," Julian began, his voice strong despite his physical challenges. "Thank you all for being here tonight. 5 years ago, when I started the Cross Foundation, I had a simple goal: to create real pathways out of poverty and unemployment. Not charity, not handouts, but genuine opportunities for people who'd been written off by society." He spoke about the foundation's work, about the first building they'd completed, about the 6 families who would move in next week. He showed photographs of the transformation, the before and after images that captured not just physical renovation, but the renewal of hope. "But this work isn't about buildings," Julian continued. "It's about people. It's about seeing worth where others see only failure. It's about believing in second chances, not as charity, but as investment in human potential." Neil watched the audience, saw some genuinely moved, others politely attentive, a few checking their phones discreetly. "Tonight I want to tell you a story," Julian said. 6 weeks ago, I watched a man give his last $3 to help my mother buy breakfast. He had nothing. He was unemployed, facing foreclosure, counting his final dollars. But when he saw someone who needed help, he didn't hesitate. The room grew quieter. People leaned forward slightly. "That man is here tonight," Julian said, "and he's going to tell you why this work matters. Why investing in people, really investing in them, changes everything." He extended his hand toward Neil. "I'd like to introduce you to Neil Barlow, the incoming executive director of the Cross Foundation." The applause was polite but measured. Neil stood on legs that felt unsteady. He walked to the podium, feeling hundreds of eyes on him, feeling the weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces: wealth, power, influence, people who'd never known what it felt like to be invisible, to be discarded, to count your last dollars and wonder how you'd survive. And there, at the table near the front, sat Floyd and his crew, working men in borrowed suits, looking at Neil with absolute faith, believing in him because he'd believed in them first. Neil pulled the index card from his pocket, looked at the words he'd written, then he put the card away. He didn't need prepared remarks. He needed to tell his truth. 3 months ago, Neil began, his voice rough but steady, I was invisible. I was 50 years old, Neil continued, gripping the podium. I'd worked construction for 23 years. I'd been a good employee, a loyal foreman, someone who showed up every day and did honest work. And then my company downsized, and suddenly none of that mattered. I was just another middle-aged worker with no degree and no prospects. The room was completely silent now. Neil could feel their attention, real attention, not polite obligation. I spent 6 months looking for work. 73 applications, 73 rejections. I watched my savings disappear. I sold everything I could. I was 30 days from losing my mother's house, the only thing she'd left me when she died. His voice caught slightly. I knew what it felt like to be discarded, to be invisible, to wonder if anyone in the world saw you as something other than a problem to be managed or ignored. He looked directly at Gregory Ashton, the skeptical board member. On a December morning, I walked into a café with $3. My last $3. I planned to buy 1 cup of coffee and sit in the warmth for as long as they'd let me. But when I got to the counter, there was an elderly woman counting change, trying to scrape together enough for breakfast. And I realized someone needed help more than I needed that coffee. Neil saw Beatrice in the audience, tears streaming down her face, Julian's arm around her shoulders. I paid for her breakfast. We sat together. We talked about life, about loss, about holding on when everything tells you to let go. And what I didn't know was that her son was watching from across the street. He gestured toward Julian. He saw that moment, saw me give what I didn't have. And he decided I was worth investing in. The audience was leaning forward now, fully engaged. But here's what I need you to understand, Neil said, his voice growing stronger. Julian didn't save me. He didn't rescue me. He gave me an opportunity to save myself. He gave me work that mattered. He gave me a team to lead. He gave me dignity. Neil paused. And that's what this foundation does. We don't save people. We invest in them. We give them tools, training, and, most importantly, we give them the belief that they're worth the investment. He pointed toward Floyd's table. These men sitting right there, they've rebuilt an entire building from the foundation up. They've taken something broken and made it beautiful. They've shown up every day with skill and dedication and pride. Not because someone saved them, but because someone believed in them. Floyd stood up. Then Barlow, then Reggie. One by one, the entire crew rose to their feet, standing in their borrowed suits, their calloused hands clasped in front of them, their faces reflecting both pride and emotion. The audience began to applaud, softly at first, then building. Nobody should have to choose between dignity and survival, Neil said, his voice carrying over the applause. Nobody should be invisible because they made mistakes or faced hardship or didn't fit someone's idea of valuable. We all deserve a second chance, not as charity, as recognition that every person has worth. The applause grew louder. Julian's vision is to expand this work into 12 cities over the next 5 years. To renovate hundreds of buildings, to employ thousands of people who've been overlooked and undervalued, to create communities where second chances aren't rare gifts, they're standard practice. Neil's voice rose with passion. And I'm standing here tonight, formerly unemployed, formerly invisible, asking you to invest in that vision. Not because it's kind, but because it works. He looked out at the audience, at the wealth and influence gathered in this room, and felt something shift. They were seeing him now, really seeing him. Not as a charity case Julian had plucked from obscurity, but as someone who understood both the problem and the solution in ways they never could. $3 for a coffee and sandwich, Neil said quietly. That's all it took to change my life. Imagine what we can do with your support tonight. Imagine how many lives we can change, how many families we can stabilize, how many communities we can rebuild. He paused. Imagine if we stopped seeing people as problems and started seeing them as possibilities. The room erupted. The audience rose to their feet. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine, sustained standing ovation. Neil stood at the podium, overwhelmed, watching as people who doubted him moments ago now stood applauding the truth he'd shared. Floyd was crying openly now, his arm around Barlow. The entire crew was on their feet, clapping harder than anyone, their faces radiating pride and validation. Julian made his way to the podium, moving slowly but purposefully. He embraced Neil, and Neil felt Julian's tremor, felt the disease taking its toll, but also felt the man's absolute conviction that he'd made the right choice. "That's your executive director," Julian said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the person who'll lead this foundation forward." The applause continued, and donors began moving toward the pledge tables before the formal ask had even been made. Board members who'd been skeptical were nodding, reconsidering. Gregory Ashton caught Neil's eye and gave a single nod of respect, perhaps even approval. Beatrice pushed through the crowd to reach Neil, throwing her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered. "You made them see." "I just told the truth," Neil said. "That's all it ever takes," she replied. The evening continued with pledges exceeding projections, with board members committing additional support, with media requesting interviews. But what Neil remembered most was Floyd approaching him as the crowd thinned, taking his hand in a firm grip. "You made us visible tonight, brother," Floyd said. "You told our story, and you made them see us as men, not problems." His voice broke. "Thank you. You made yourselves visible," Neil said. "I just pointed people in the right direction." As the gala wound down and guests departed, Neil stood with Julian and Beatrice in the emptying ballroom. "It's yours now," Julian said simply. "The foundation, the mission, the future. You've earned it." Neil looked at the man who'd given him everything, who'd seen worth where others saw only failure, who'd invested in him when he had nothing to offer but character. "I won't let you down," Neil promised. "I know," Julian said. "That's why I chose you." Outside, snow was falling again, soft and steady, covering the city in white. A new year, a new beginning. A new chapter in a story that had started with $3 and a cup of coffee. And Neil Barlow, once invisible, now stood at the center of something that would change thousands of lives. The work was just beginning. 6 months later, early summer painted the city in green and gold. Neil stood in front of the third completed building, watching as families moved furniture into their new homes. Children's laughter echoed through the courtyard, a sound that had been absent from this neighborhood for too long. The Cross Foundation had exceeded every projection. The expansion into the first new city was ahead of schedule. Corporate partnerships had doubled. The board, once skeptical, now championed Neil's leadership with genuine enthusiasm. Even Gregory Ashton had become an advocate, introducing Neil to potential donors and calling him exactly what nonprofit leadership should look like. But the numbers and accolades weren't what mattered most to Neil. It was moments like this, watching Floyd supervise a new crew with the same patience and respect Neil had shown him. Seeing Paolo celebrate 3 years of sobriety with his family at his side. Hearing that Reggie's daughter had moved back to the city and they were rebuilding their relationship. Floyd had become the foundation's senior carpenter, training crews in multiple cities. His custom woodwork had become a signature of Crossy. Foundation buildings, something beautiful and lasting that carried his name. Just last week, an architectural magazine had featured his work, calling him a master craftsman bringing artistry to affordable housing. "Never thought I'd be in a magazine," Floyd had said, showing Neil the article with obvious pride. "Never thought anyone would call my work art again." "It always was," Neil had replied. "Now people are just paying attention." Neil's mother's house was alive now, in ways it hadn't been even when she was living. Every Sunday, the crew gathered for dinner, a rotating group of men and their families, sharing food and stories and the easy companionship that comes from shared struggle and shared success. The house that had felt so empty after her death now echoed with laughter and conversation and life. Vernon, one of the newer crew members, had moved into the first completed building with his adult son, who'd also found work through the foundation. They'd been homeless for 18 months before the program. Now they had stability, purpose, family dinners around their own table. Julian's condition had progressed, as they'd known it would. He used a cane now, and his speech required more concentration. But he remained deeply involved, attending board meetings, mentoring Neil, celebrating every victory. His mind was as sharp as ever, his commitment undiminished by physical limitations. Beatrice still volunteered 3 days a week, though Julian had tried countless times to convince her to rest. "I'll rest when I'm dead," she told him with characteristic directness. "Right now I've got work to do." She and Neil had developed a relationship that felt like family. She was the grandmother presence in his life, offering wisdom when he struggled, celebration when he succeeded, and unconditional support always. He'd asked her once why she'd been so immediately kind to him that morning in the café. "Because I saw my son in you," she'd said simply. "Saw someone struggling, but holding on to their goodness. Saw someone who needed to know they mattered." She'd patted his hand. "And I was right, wasn't it?" Today, Neil was meeting with a young man named Christopher, recently released after 5 years in prison for a mistake made at 23. Christopher sat across from Neil in the foundation office, nervous and hopeful in equal measure. "I don't have much experience," Christopher was saying. "I mean, I worked in the prison shop, learned some basic carpentry, but nobody wants to hire someone with a record." Neil listened, hearing echoes of his own story in the young man's words. The doubt, the shame, the belief that past mistakes defined future possibilities. "Let me tell you something," Neil said. 6 months ago I was unemployed and desperate. I thought my life was over at 50. Then someone gave me a chance. Not because I was perfect, but because they saw potential in me." He leaned forward. "I see that same potential in you. The question is, are you willing to do the work?" Christopher's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, sir. Absolutely yes." "Then you start Monday. Floyd will be your supervisor. He's tough but fair. Show up on time, work hard, treat people with respect, and you'll have a future here." After Christopher left, Neil sat alone in his office. On his desk was a photograph from the gala, him, Julian and Beatrice with their arms around each other, all three smiling. It reminded him daily of how far he'd come and why the work mattered. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Barlow, this is Christopher. I just wanted to say thank you. You gave me hope when I'd lost it. I won't let you down." Neil smiled and typed back, "You already haven't. See you Monday." That afternoon, Neil drove to his mother's grave. The cemetery was peaceful in the summer warmth, birds singing in the trees overhead. He knelt beside her headstone, touching the warm granite. "I wish you could see it, Mom," he said softly. "Wish you could see what came from those $3. We're changing lives now, hundreds of them. And it's all because you taught me that kindness matters, that dignity matters, that people matter." He touched the ring he still wore around his neck. "I'm doing what you raised me to do. I'm treating people the way you taught me. And it's working. It's really working." A breeze rustled through the trees, warm and gentle. Neil stood and walked back to his truck. He had a meeting in an hour, a site visit after that, dinner with the crew tonight. His life was full in ways he'd never imagined possible. As he drove back toward the city, he passed the café where it had all begun. On impulse, he pulled over and went inside. The same cheerful barista was working. "What can I get you?" she asked. Neil pulled out his wallet and placed a 20 on the counter. "2 coffees," he said. "One for me and one for whoever comes in next and looks like they need it." The barista smiled knowingly. "You do this often?" "As often as I can," Neil said. "Someone did it for me once, changed my life." He took his coffee and sat at the table by the window, the same table where he'd sat with Beatrice 6 months ago. Outside, the city moved in its endless rhythm. People rushing to jobs, to homes, to lives both broken and whole. Neil thought about Julian's words from that first day. Character reveals itself in how we treat people when there's nothing to gain from it. He'd given $3 when he had nothing, and the world had given him everything in return, not because kindness was transactional, but because kindness was multiplicative. It rippled outward in ways you could never predict, creating circles that kept expanding, touching lives you'd never meet, changing futures you'd never see. The barista called out, "Your order's ready," to someone at the counter, a tired-looking woman counting change coming up short. Neil stood and walked over. "I've got it," he said, placing money on the counter. "And would you like to sit? I was just leaving, and there's a good table by the window." The woman looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Neil said, and as he handed her one of Julian's business cards, he added, "If you're looking for work, call this number. Tell them Neil sent you." He walked out into the summer sunshine, feeling his mother's presence like a benediction. The ring around his neck caught the light, warm against his chest. $3, 1 cup of coffee, 1 moment of kindness. That's all it took to change everything. And somewhere, in ways he'd never fully know, the ripples continued spreading outward. One person, one chance, one act of compassion at a time. Neil Barlow was no longer invisible, and he was making sure no one else would be either.